Now we're going to take a look at some of our variable density settings and some of our other settings that are related to that. I'm going to start out just by adding a standard plane, just because it really is the best way to really demonstrate some of these settings. I'm just going to increase the size of this, reposition our camera, and then we're going to go ahead and just open up our advanced material editor. But first I want to just load in, let's use that grass texture again, just so we have a nice underlying material. And if we double click in our material preview, we can open up our advanced material editor. I'm going to go back and click on EcoSystem, and this way we add our EcoSystem layer. And I want to add a plant once again. And I'm just going to be using our fir tree for this example, and click OK. I'm going to go ahead and just click Populate right away to see exactly where our size stands. And I'm going to bring that down to 0.8, just so it's a little bit smaller. Now we're in the Density tab, and I'm just going to go ahead and turn off some of these different options because they're really not needed. So I'm going to turn off Decay for foreign objects and populate below foreign objects as possible, just so our ground plane and any other objects don't really interfere with what we have. Now with our overall density, I'm going to go ahead and turn this up to a much higher amount. So we're at about 90%, and we can see we have pretty much full coverage of our plane. And now we want to use our variable density. So we're going to go ahead and just click our little box to turn it on. And you notice that we have this ungrade, and it's all active. And we have our main material, which is our function. To the right of that is our filter that we can use to adjust the overall setting, and it just gives us a little bit of extra control besides what we have in the function editor. We can also adjust our scale overall of this function. I'm going to right mouse click on our preview and just go to Edit Function. This is going to pull up our function editor, and now we can adjust the overall density with functions and images, and so we could use a noise node or a fractal node or anything within here to create varied levels of density. Now you notice that right now this current layer that we have selected says bump. Now this is actually our density, and the fact that the name is different does not change anything. It is still our density. And I'm going to start out by adding, let's just use we could use either a fractal or a noise node. And I'm going to use a fractal node because it's going to give us a little bit better quality and a little more variation throughout the material, because noise nodes can be very repetitious and very pattern-like with the results that they give. But of course, fractal nodes can take a little bit longer to produce the results and maybe render those results depending on what it is that you're working on. Right now we have our default with the wavelength set to 1, 1, and 1 on each of the axes. I'm going to go ahead and change these both, or all three of them, to 0.5. What I also want to do is increase our gain just so that we get a little bit more of a contrast between our dark areas and our light areas. So in other words, our dense areas and then our sparse areas. Can also increase our roughness to give a little bit more of a varied effect. So let's just take a look at that. I'm going to populate. And now we can see this function controlling our density. And I'm just going to go ahead and rotate our view so that we can see this a little bit better. I'm also going to zoom out. So we can use any number of functions to really control the different levels of density. I'm going to go back into our advanced material editor, and we're just going to edit the filter and take a look at the different effects that achieves and how that alters our different levels of density within the created function that we have. So I'm just going to right mouse click on that and edit filter, and I'm going to go ahead and pull down our top value and click OK and repopulate. And now by doing so, what we've done is expanded our areas of lower density. So in other words, our black areas and our white areas of our function are going to be our most dense areas. So I can edit our filter again and just reduce that amount to even lower level and click OK and populate that. And we're going to see even more of a reduction within the material. And that also works the other way around. Go ahead and edit this filter, and we can drag that all the way up the top. And I'm going to go ahead and click and drag all the way to the bottom corner and click New Key Point. And that way we can edit on this other side. And I'm just going to pull up and click OK, and now populate. And once we bring up that left section, our left section is going to be the lowest levels in this case. So what we can see is that we have instances created everywhere, but they are a lot less dense. And now this is also controlled by our overall density. So if I reduce our overall density to about 50% and populate, now we can see a huge reduction in everything, but we still have these areas were no instances before, all corresponding to our filter. We can also go a little bit beyond just standard editing here. We can add a couple of more key points. I'm also going to turn on curves for this and just vary this a little and click OK. And repopulate. And what we're going to see is a variation going in between our different levels. And I'm going to bring our overall density back up so we can see that a little bit better. So now we notice patches in areas where there weren't before. We could also control this function scale. I'm just going to reset our filter so we can take a look at our original and just our function. I'm going to reduce this down to 0.5 and click populate. And now we can see we've scaled down our entire function. If you just want to, if you have multiple layers of functions and multiple nodes connected to each other, you want to make sure that you're selecting specifically the node you are working on rather than the entire function scale. And by using these functions, we can create just an unlimited amount of effects, and there's so many possibilities with different nodes that we can create pretty much anything we want throughout our ecosystem. I'm going to go ahead and reset this back to 1 on all of our different axes. We're going to take a look at image map density. So what I want to do is edit our function to go back into our function editor, and I'm just going to delete this current function. And we can also see now that we do have the density showing instead of the bump. If I come over here to the left, what we can do is add this node, which is going to be our texture map node. It's located just underneath the colored node. And we also have a couple of different options for this. We can use a texture map, a projected texture map, animation map, projected animation map, a blended image, and a blended grayscale image. So we have a lot of different options with here. We're just going to stick with the projected texture map because this seems to work very well for this. And I'm going to go ahead and change this to flat vertical for our mapping mode, and that way we're coming down directly onto the surface. Now I've just prepared a couple of image maps ahead of time, and those are located in the content folder of the CD-ROM, so you can go ahead and just load those into view and follow along if you want. The first image I have loaded in is just called Circle, and it's a bitmap file. And I would suggest mainly using bitmap files for saving your specific image-based density maps because they seem to work a little bit better, and you don't have to worry about some of the compression issues that you'll have with using JPEG images. So now that we have just this basic texture loaded in, I'm going to go ahead and just click OK, and I'm going to populate our surface. We can see that our material is being repeated several times throughout this object, and the reason for that is because we're using world mapping. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to object parametric and click populate. And now when we have our function scale set to 1, that extends the entire limit of our object. When we have it set to world mapping, that is based on the grid units within view and its grid scale and the overall object units within view. So therefore, if we have, like we had before, 1, 1, 1, that's using the scale in reference to everything in the scene and not specifically to an object. So right now we have this set to object parametric, and therefore we're using a function scale of 1, 1, 1, which is the full extent of our object. If I change this to 0.5 on all of our axes and click populate, we can see this reduced. And basically the point where we're displaying 2 of everything. And even though our position is set up to where this is sort of cut in half, it is basically showing double. So I'm going to change this back to 1, repopulate, and we're going to take a look at our sampling quality. Now our sampling quality is related to how well and how much our instances confine to the edges of our map that we've created. And specifically this works mainly on image maps. Of course it does work overall, and you might see different settings just by using functions, but it's definitely most important when you're working with image maps. So I'm going to reduce our sampling quality down to about 50% and populate. And we really don't see much of a change right now. And a lot of that's due to the size of our trees that we have right now. If we increase our sampling to 100%, we also don't really see that big of a change. But we also have a very well-defined image map in this case, where we might not even see all that big of a difference. I'm going to go ahead and change our scale of these trees. Let's go down to 0.5 and populate. And I'm just going to go ahead and zoom in to these areas a little bit better. What I'm also going to do is reduce our density just a little. So we'll go to our density tab, just make a reduction, and hit populate. Now I'm going to go ahead and adjust our sampling quality again, bring this down to 0. And once again, we really don't see a change at all. And I'm going to increase our fir trees now, because when we have larger trees, it's a little bit harder to place as many of them precisely. So I'm going to go ahead and change this up to 1.5 and hit populate. And I'm just going to go ahead and zoom out. And we can see we've actually lost the detail through the center, where we have a line going through this image. So if we go back to our density, and increase that sampling quality and hit populate, and we can notice that there once again was no change. And a lot of this, like I said, has to do with the sizes of our instances in relation to the actual image map. And like I said, in this case, this is a very straightforward black and white image. So we're going to go ahead and load in another image and take a look at the effects of that. So we're going to open up our function editor, and I'm going to load in the gradient bitmap file. Now this is just a very basic gradient bitmap. We have white on the left side and black on the right side. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK and click populate. And I also want to make sure that we have our mapping set to object parametric. And we are going to take a look at our sampling quality for this. And if we change back, what we have is our sampling quality set to 0, populate. I'm going to go ahead and change that up to 100% and click populate once again. And we can see that some of our trees start to change, and most of the settings about confining to specific areas. So you will see varied results throughout different materials and different objects, image maps that you're using for your variable density. And it's just something to keep in mind that the sampling quality is there. If you're running into problems where you're having a problem keeping some of your instances along certain lines, or maybe they're too close to the line and following along with your edges. Also keep in mind that the higher the sampling quality, the longer it can take to populate some of your ecosystems. But like I said, a lot of that depends on specific images and what it is that you have in your scene. Also, depending on the texture resolution of your image maps. And these ones are 2048 by 2048. So there's usually not a lot of problems working with the higher resolutions. If you're working with a little bit of a lower resolution, you might see a little bit different of a change. Another thing we notice, if I just go ahead and drag this out of the way, we can see that even though we have a gradient, for the most part we have a large amount of population and density throughout almost the whole surface. So if I go ahead and change our overall density down to 50% and populate, we can notice a little more of it following along with our controlled density. I'm going to go ahead and just increase that a little bit more. And what we can also do is use our filter to adjust these settings as well. So I can reduce that right side once again, populate, and we notice a little less distribution throughout. So there's lots of different ways we can manipulate these settings and play around with them to get exactly what it is we want. And before we start taking a look at some of the other features that are affected by density, I'm going to go ahead and change out this image map once again. Now I've loaded in the circle gradient image that we have. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And if we populate this and take a look, we can see basically the same effect with the gradient before, except now we have a different image controlling that. So we have a lower amounts of densities on the outside with a very high amount of density on the inside. And now we're going to take a look at some of the other features that are directly related to this density. And some of them have to do with scaling, and some of them have to do with color. In the Scaling and Orientation tab, on the bottom we see that we have Shrink at Low Densities. Well, this is a very cool little effect. I'm going to go ahead and turn this on right now, and we can repopulate. And what we notice is that our trees in the lower densities start to get smaller. So we can adjust our influence of this and populate. And we notice our trees get even smaller on the outsides, and they're much larger on the inside. So the more we adjust this influence, the more we can see this effect. I'm also going to decrease our density just a little bit, so we can see a little bit more of the fade in that gradient. If you go back, we can also adjust the radius of this and the fall off. So if I increase our radius, click populate, we can see that more of the trees become smaller. And then of course our fall off, which adjusts sort of the reverse of the radius, and we can see this area and how big we are affecting it. See, the more we adjust the fall off, we can see less changes on the outer rim. And if we reduce our fall off even more, we can really go into the inside and adjusting our radius. And I'm just going to set these back to our defaults, which we have 50%, 50%, and 0%, and populate that once again. Now another really cool effect that we can get based on this density is color at low density. So if I go back, and I'm just going to go back to the scaling, and I can get rid of that and populate, so we can focus mainly on color. And I want to reposition our camera so we can get a better idea of what we've already have in our scene and what the changes are to affect that. And we're going to be paying attention to our main camera preview. And I'm just going to pull that out to make that a little bit larger. And in this case, the kind of effect I want to create is have trees that are dying on the outside and the outer rims of this area at the lower densities, and then on the inside they can be the normal color, alive and well. So if we go back to our plane and we open up our advanced material editor, we're going to go to our color tab and select color at low densities. Now what we get is a decay color, which works similar to the way our atmosphere editor works with its decay color. So instead of having one constant color that it's changing to, we have a color that's being added to it that gives a much nicer blend, very similar to using the multiply mode within Photoshop and other programs similar to that. So I'm going to jump to decay color, and we want to use more of a brown and something a little bit darker. And I'm going to click OK, and now we can populate. And right now, because our influence isn't set very high, we don't really notice that large of a change throughout our materials. So what I want to do is increase our influence all the way to 100% and populate once again. And we could even adjust the radius just a little bit. And what we can see in the preview, just by looking at even the rough preview, we can see we have, of course, our regular colored maple trees fading to a little bit darker. So it's a really neat way to create some sort of effects that you're looking for, where we can have our lower densities a different color. And that way we can work on edges and things like that to give that varied color amount. What I'm also going to do is just go ahead and change this to a very obvious color. Let's just change that to a blue and repopulate. And now what we can see is a very, very obvious effect within our preview, where we have blue trees on the outside fading to the green trees on the inside. So we, of course, don't necessarily have to do something realistic. We can do pretty much anything we want with it. And of course, we also have above color at low densities within our color tab is our overall color. So we could change this overall color. I'm going to do something, once again, very obvious so that we can see it and repopulate. Always making sure that we repopulate. And now we can see we have red on the inside where it's most dense, and then blue on the outside where it's the least dense. This is also another really good way to sort of take a look at your scenes and preparation for certain things. So in other words, if we have a scene that we're working on and we want to know exactly where the lower densities are, this is a good way to display those areas. Even if we're not necessarily going to use the effect, we can take a look and overall see the effects and where are the lower densities of our scene and where are the higher densities. So it's a good way to just tell back and forth exactly what you're working with. And we can also notice that we still have our original color saved within our color correction. And if we want to go back to that color, all we got to do is right mouse click and go to reset color. And that works within any area of view where we have those original colors saved in there and we want to get back to them. So all we really have to do is right mouse click and click on Reset. We're going to go back to the Scaling and Orientation tab now and take a look at some of these other options that we have, and of course our variable scaling, which works very similar to any functions we used for density, and also those functions can be used for variable color, and we'll be getting to that a little bit later. But the first thing I want to do is remove our density that we have right now. So we can just go ahead and check that off, and I'm going to click Populate. And we're also back to more of our original color, but I am going to turn off color at low densities and repopulate, and that way that blue color is not interfering. If we can now go back to our original rural maple tree color, switch back to our Scaling and Orientation tab, and let's take a look at some of our options. Our first option, as I was explaining before, is our overall scaling, which affects everything contained within our ecosystem population. So in other words, if we have multiple plants in here, this overall scaling is going to affect all of them and not just individual specific plants or objects. What we can also see is our maximum size variation. Right now, only the X is highlighted. Now, of course, this can also depend on the way your axes are set up. So if we go up to File and we take a look at Options, and we're going to click on the General Preferences tab, and what we can see in the World Coordinate System is we can change whether or not we have the X-axis up or the Z-axis up, and whether or not it's left-handed or right-handed. We also have a default rotation order, so we can change which axes we want to view. This is really up to you. If you're used to working in other programs where you have the axes aligned differently, then this is where you can change that. So also that reflects upon what's going to be available when you're looking at certain settings. So knowing what you have set is a pretty good idea. Right now, most of our proportions are kept at uniform, which means we can only change, like I said, the x-axis. So I'm going to go ahead and populate that, and now we can see the overall changes that we have with variation, and it's a variation up to 3. And now if we want to change our proportions on our other scales, all we really have to do is move this down to a little less non-uniform. So we can change now our size variations on all the different axes. So I could increase our Z up a little bit higher and populate that. And we get a very interesting looking effect where we have some trees that are stretched out in different directions. We can also do that on the Y. We can make that a little bit higher and populate that. And we can see different variations that way. And I'm just going to go ahead and change that back to uniform and bring the X to 1 and repopulate. So we're kind of back to where we were before. Now what we can also see is below we have a direction from surface. Now right now we have it 20%, which is mostly vertical. So in other words, we have a slight slant on some of our different objects, but not on all of them. We could, of course, increase that and populate. And a lot of these settings are also kind of linked together. I'm going to go ahead and change these back to 111 and populate. We can see a little bit of a change. And we can adjust just the overall direction from our surface. And of course we're working with a completely flat object right now. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and just swap out some objects. Click OK. And just close out of that. And actually I'm just going to delete our plane. And I'm going to load in a sphere. And once again we can see that we have those bounding boxes showing up. And that's mainly because the amount of resources that it can take to record the screen. And I'm going to go ahead and select our sphere. I'm going to add the ecosystem, go to General, and add a plant. I'm going to select the rural maple tree again. We're going to populate. And now we really don't see anything, so I'm going to go ahead and change that to a lower value. Let's do 0.5 and populate. You can see the trees are a little bit smaller. Let's go to 0.1. and go a lot smaller. And now we can see these objects. And we can also see that they're all going straight up and down. I'm going to increase our density so we can see a little bit more of them. And now we're going to go back to our scaling and orientation tab. And if we take a look, direction from surface, I'm going to go ahead and increase that to more of a perpendicular and click populate. And now we can see these plants are conforming a lot more to the surface and kind of growing off to the sides and populate. And this way it conforms to a curve that we have. So it depends on whether or not you want your trees to be growing like this, or any object really. I mean, of course you don't have to be using trees, but right now this is what we're using. We can go back and change that all the way to vertical and hit populate. And now we can see we have these trees just growing straight up. So really, depending on the amount of realism you want, you have this setting available, and it's really great for a lot of different effects. What we also have is a rotation on the bottom. Now, right now we have up axis only, and that means we're pretty much just rotating around standard so that all of our trees are facing straight up, and we just have that slight bit of rotation. Well, if we change this to all axes, I'm going to go ahead and click populate, we can see that our trees are rotating all over the place. And if I increase our amount of rotation, we can see that effect a little bit more. And what I'm also going to do is just display this a little bit higher quality. Change that to smooth shaded so that we can see all these trees. And if we go back into the advanced material editor, we can also see on the bottom here that we can adjust our maximum rotation and also our direction from surface and control those with fractal nodes or noise nodes or any function that we want to control any amount of these certain settings. So we could also use image maps for that, just as we used before with the density. And we can achieve really neat results and a lot more specific to what we want by using the functions. And now I'm just going to close this out and delete our current sphere. And I'm going to go ahead and add just another plane as sort of our base object. Take a look at our other main features. So we'll select our plane, and we're going to do basically the same thing that we did before. Select EcoSystem, go to General, add Plant. We're going to add the plum tree. And I just want to go ahead and populate that just to check our size. What I'm also going to do is just go ahead and add another tree in here. We'll just add our real maple tree. We'll go ahead and populate. And we can see that our maple trees are much larger. And what we can also do is adjust their presence. So now that we have multiple trees in here, if we want to have more maple trees than we do plum trees, then we can either decrease or increase these values. So let's say we wanted to have twice as many maple trees as we have plum trees. Well, I can go into presence and just type 0.5, and this is going to create half the amount. So if I click populate, we really don't see that effect because the overall scaling. So I'm going to go into our scaling and orientation tab and just lower our overall scaling. I'm going to reduce that just a bit more. And now we can see that we have all of these plum trees in here mixed in with our different maple trees. What I also want to do is just increase our density so we can see that a little bit more. And I might even go ahead and just scale that down a bit more. And we're going to reposition our camera so we can really see all of these different areas. And now let's take a look at controlling our variable scaling with functions. So we could just click to turn on our variable scaling, right mouse click and select Edit Function. and you can see that we have our scaling selected. And we can add in an image map for this if we wanted. We could also use a fractal or a noise node. And I'm just going to go ahead and add a fractal for this. And I want to change our wavelength to 0.5 on all of the axes, increase our roughness, and increase our gain. And click OK. And now I can go ahead and click Populate, and we can see our variable scaling. So just as we can control our density, we can control our scaling in the same way. And of course other features as well. If we take a look at our function, we can see we have the white areas and the black areas. The black areas in this case are going to be our smaller objects, and the white areas are going to be our larger trees. Now we also have a couple of filters next to this to adjust these settings. If we want to adjust the overall size, we can edit the size filter, and I'm just going to pull that down and click Repopulate. And we can see the overall, or the max size, has been greatly reduced. What we can also do is vary that up and down, even within our size. I'm going to add a new key point and just kind of create a little bit of a variation in there, and click Populate. So now we can see that some of the areas that earlier were smaller trees are now larger. So we can use all different types of filters to control that. And I'm just going to go ahead and reset that. And what we also can take a look at is the variance. I'm going to edit our filter, and I'm just going to pull this down and click Populate. Now we can see there most of our trees were reduced, but the variation amount of our different sizes has also been reduced. And I'm just going to change that to a curve, and we can make this a little more interesting. About the same type of filter. Click Populate. And we can see just a small amount of change where we just had our variations in sizes throughout all of our different trees change just slightly. So really depending on what sort of function you have and how you're controlling it, there's lots of different ways we can control our scaling. And now what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to our Color tab. So I'm going to turn off our variable scaling and repopulate. So we're back to our normal surface. I also am going to reduce our scale just a tiny bit on our overall scale so we can see these objects. A little more dispersed and a little bit smaller overall. And now let's take a look at our variable color. I'm going to go ahead and turn this on. And if you notice down here we have, or on the right, we have our filter, and then underneath that we have our color map. Well, I'm going to go ahead and just load in a color map right now. And then you can use a variety of different maps, any of the ones available. They're all compatible. But I want to use something that's really going to demonstrate and show you the differences. So I'm going to use this engineer and click OK. And that way we have a very large color spectrum that we'll be able to see. And if I click Populate right now, what's going to happen is we're really only going to see right now in the middle of this color map, because we don't have anything controlling which areas of the gradient map we want to see. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this function, and we're just going to add another simple node onto this. So I'm going to add a fractal. And we're just going to set up with the same settings that we have before. Increase our gain and our roughness, and click OK. And now I'm going to repopulate. And now we can see that we have a lot more of our gradient being shown within all of these objects. And basically what the function does is it controls from one end of the spectrum, or one end of our color map, to the other. And in this case what we have is our black areas of our function are on the left side, and our blue areas. And then the white sections of our fractal node are on the right side of our gradient map and our red area. And then we have everything in between sort of blending. And I'm just going to go ahead and reduce our function scale to 0.5, just so we can see a little bit more of our function in our color. And now if we take a look at the image refreshing on the right, we can see a little bit more of the spectrum in certain areas. What we can also do is adjust this color map at any time or load in a new one. I'm going to go ahead and just load in something a little bit different now. Let's just go into rock and grass and we'll grab fields and click OK. And we also want to make sure that we repopulate. And now we have a nice color variation between these greens and sort of brownish colors. So we can do some really neat looking stuff with this and really vary the way our forests look and having certain areas that may not be doing as well as others, or even create the illusion of different types of trees with this. And this is also a great way to create fall scenes with certain types of trees, more specifically broadleaf trees and maples and things like that. And what we can do is create, if we just load in a color map, we could even probably find something that's very similar that we could use. We could use something that's red, and we could of course edit what we already have, and we could just have it going through oranges into different colors. And actually, let's just go ahead and click on the canyon right now, and we'll just click populate. And now we can see we have all these different variations of color within these trees, some that are yellowish, some that are reddish, and of course you can edit your own color maps as well to find exactly what it is that you need, and then of course adjust your function to control however it is you need to affect your scene. So if you need to use image maps, you can create custom image maps for that if you want specific areas to be the way they are. You can also use the painting function to change the color as well.